Being brutally destroyed by Ilia Topuria is the best base for MMA. And that fact is becoming clearer by the day. Most recently, we saw Charles Oliveira get brutally slept by Ilia Topuria, and then go on to choke out Mateusz Gamrot in his signature performance. And this applies to virtually every other Topuria victim as well, as every fighter who Ilia has faced in the UFC, with one exception who isn't even really an exception, has gone on to win their next fight. So today, I want to examine the Ilia Topuria effect, a phenomenon where every fighter who gets beaten by Ilia Topuria goes on to win their next fight in what is often a career-defining performance. In other words, every fighter who Ilia Topuria beats to a pulp immediately goes on to prove that they aren't washed. So in this video, I'd like to go through every single opponent that Ilia has had in the UFC, and then have a look at what his opponent has gone on to accomplish after losing to Ilia. But anyways, let's go through this analysis chronologically, starting with Ilia's first opponent in the UFC. So you know how I said there is one exception to the Ilia Topuria effect? Well, here he is, Youssef Zalal. But as you'd likely be aware if you watched any recent UFC pay-per-views, he really isn't a true exception. When Ilia Topuria and Youssef Zalal crossed paths, Youssef Zalal was on a 3-fight win streak in the UFC, albeit it wasn't against good competition. I mean, one of the guys who Zalal beat was Austin Lingo, who went on to get brutally KO'd by Cam Teague in Fury FC. And while Cam Teague is the guy who has been brutally flatlined twice on Dana White's Contender Series, so I think you can tell what level of competition we're talking about here. But anyways, this fight is the only Ilia Topuria fight in the UFC where we saw him implement a grappling-heavy game plan. Throughout the fight, Ilia took down and handedly outgrappled Youssef Zalal, nearly finishing him on 2 occasions with an anaconda choke and a mounted guillotine. Topuria landed some boxing combinations too, but they didn't have the pop that he would later go on to show. But even still, he was landing some of these punches very cleanly, and we need to give some credit to Zalal's chin here. The guy hasn't been finished once throughout his MMA career, and while I may have missed a fight or two, I haven't seen him get dropped either. But anyways, after losing to Topuria, something seemed to go wrong for Zalal, because he went on to lose to Sungwoo Choi, a fighter who really isn't that great, and that one guy at featherweight who's 6'3" who looks like he's straight out of an episode of Dan Da Dan. In all 3 of these losses, Zalal just kinda got outworked. He spent much of those fights circling with his back to the fence, throwing pot shots, and he just got beaten on volume and pressure. After going on this 3-fight loss streak, Zalal dropped down to bantamweight for a fight against Damon Blackshear, where he showed the same issues with the volume for the first 2 rounds, before nearly finishing Blackshear in the 3rd. But that was just enough to earn Zalal a draw. This led to Zalal being cut from the UFC. But, from this incredibly low point, Zalal would make a comeback. Zalal would go on to have a 3-fight finishing streak outside of the UFC to earn his way back, where he'd make his re-debut against Billy Quarantillo, and he'd win that by submission. From there, he'd get 2 more submissions against Jarno Aarons and Jack Shore to earn a shot against the ranked Calvin Kattar. And well, he kinda went back to his old ways where he tip-tapped to a decision against Kattar, but Kattar is also nearly impossible to finish anyways, so there's that. But after that, he went and submitted Josh Emmett with a slick armbar, so let's just try to delete that Kattar fight from our minds, like how Ilia's wife deleted any photos of him from her Instagram. But anyways, while Ilia might have started Zalal's losing streak, he's now made a complete turnaround, and is now 1 or 2 fights away from fighting for the title. And when you consider how good of a grappler Zalal is, getting all those wins by submission and all, and then we go back to how Ilia nearly submitted Zalal twice, it really hammers home just how good Ilia Topuria is and how potent the Ilia Topuria effect can be. So Damon Jackson has a much simpler story than Youssef Zalal, but it's one where the Ilia Topuria effect is much easier to see. Damon Jackson fought Ilia Topuria when they were both 1-0 in the UFC, and this was the fight where we first saw the brutality that Ilia could inflict with his boxing. Ilia tore up Jackson with jabs and hooks to the body, got him up to the cage, and then viciously knocked him out with a body shot and overhand combo. Now, this knockout was pretty nasty, with Jackson going completely limp, and it took some time for Damon Jackson to come back, But when he did, he went on to have a 4-fight win streak, including a KO win against Pat Sabatini. And that's a really underrated win, since the only other fighter who Pat has lost to in the UFC is Diego Lopez. But anyways, Damon Jackson's run wasn't fated to last, as he ended up getting gatekept from the rankings by Dan Ige, and is now retired after getting submitted by the Unk Jim Miller. But really, we all know that Damon Jackson's downfall could have probably been prevented with another brutal punch from Ilia Topuria. Remember when Joe Rogan was glazing Ryan Hall for his leg lock game? Where he was going all,
"Oh, you do not want to be there with that guy. Those heel hooks are nasty, man."
And look, Topuria just came in and gave us a reminder. Leg locks don't work in MMA. Unless you're at heavyweight and your name is Walter Walker, of course. But that just goes to show how bad heavyweight MMA is. This fight was just Ryan Hall throwing kicks at range until Topuria grabbed hold of him while throwing a spinning kick, took him down, and just beat him unconscious. After this loss to Ilia, Ryan Hall went on to get a decision win against Derek Minner, which I haven't bothered to watch because it's probably the same old kicking at range and butt scooting Ryan Hall always does when he can't get a quick leg lock sub. And he hasn't fought since. He recently got officially released from the UFC, and I'm pretty sure he's just focused on training other fighters nowadays. But still, it's almost as if that win over Minner is there with the sole purpose of proving the Ilia Topuria effect. Ah yes, Jai Herbert, my favorite Ilia Topuria victim. I can't play that KO here for copyright reasons. But man, that knockout is a thing of beauty. Left hook to get Herbert to drop his guard ever so slightly, and then BAM! Right overhand over the top that just completely folds Jai Herbert. And as Ilia has become a 2-weight world champion and a megastar, it's kinda ironic how Jai Herbert has increasingly become known as that one guy who dropped Ilia Topuria. And if you look at Volkanovski and Max Holloway's fights with Ilia, you would see them throwing that lead left high kick to try and catch him. But yeah, this fight was really defined by Herbert's 1 in a million high kick, Ilia's recovery from that shot, and then Topuria's highlight reel KO victory. Herbert also used knees to try and keep Ilia at range, but Ilia's pressure was just too much, and it led to him getting slept. However, even though this is the kind of KO that you'd think would lead to a series of brutal chinnings, that hasn't been the case for Herbert, who hasn't been finished since this loss. And that's not the only blessing that Ilia Topuria bestowed with his fists, as just 4 months after his fight with Topuria, Jai Herbert got a decision win over Kyle Nelson, who is a solid-ish fighter and the best win of Jai's entire career. Then, after beating Nelson, Jai Herbert went to a draw against Ludovic Klein, who is a good lightweight outside the rankings. Jai Herbert has been winning one and losing one since, but he owes the Kyle Nelson W to the Ilia Topuria effect.
Well, ain't it Bryce Mitchell, the old country boy who'd gone fishing with the internet's favorite Austrian artist, the white boy with a farm, pickup truck, and who has the same number of functional brain cells as he does stitches in his scrotum. Now, going into this here fight, Thug Nasty and Topuria were both undefeated in professional MMA, with Bryce coming off a whooping of Edson Barboza, who, by the way, is Khabib Nurmagomedov's 5th best win. During this fight, Bryce was getting beat up pretty badly on the feet, although he was getting off that southpaw left hand at times to keep Ilia from smashing him. And he even got Ilia down. But then, in the second round, Ilia whooped him good, got him in an arm triangle, and choked him out. But after this hiding, Bryce made a comeback by controlling Dan Ige to a decision. And now I know that the Dan Ige fight was close and could have been a robbery, but it still goes to show that Bryce is still a competent fighter. And while Bryce went on to have a couple other nasty losses, him beating a Nurmagomedov in Abu Dhabi of all places just goes to show that Topuria ain't no can crusher.
So this fight was probably one of those brutal beatings I've ever witnessed. One of the judges scored this a 50-42, and for good reason too. Topuria tore Emmett up over the course of 5 rounds, bloodied him up, knocked him down, and basically evaded all of Emmett's counters without much effort. And this fight really highlighted Emmett's durability, since more technical fighters than him went on to get finished by Topuria, but it's also just an enormous amount of damage to take. However, even though Topuria's fists did tear Emmett apart, he did end up giving the Orc from Team Alpha Male a great blessing as well. After losing to Topuria in June of 2023, Josh Emmett ended up getting booked to fight Giga Chikadze in December of the same year. Chikadze ended up pulling out with a groin injury and ended up getting replaced by Bryce Mitchell. Now, both Bryce and Emmett had been blessed with the Ilia Topuria effect, but Bryce had made the mistake of getting that win over Dan Ige before fighting Emmett. And so, even though Bryce Mitchell was a sizable favorite and Emmett had taken a ton of damage from Topuria just a few months back, the outcome was inevitable. I mean, that is a career-defining highlight for Josh Emmett. And sure, he's gone on to lose twice in a row after that win, but that KO he got over Bryce Mitchell is just a picture-perfect summation of everything Emmett's about. So this instance of the Ilia Topuria effect is probably the most well-known one, and it really goes on to show how good both Volk and Ilia are. In their fight, Volkanovski outlanded Ilia in the first round with kicks and jabs, even winning the round on all three judges' scorecards. However, if you watch the fight, you would know just from the body language alone that Volk was fighting way too defensively, and that he'd get caught sooner or later. And well, it happened in the second round. Ilia backed Volk up to the fence with a right overhand, and then knocked him out with a right hook. After this loss, everybody was telling Volk to just retire. He was coming off of 2 KO losses, and everybody thought that his chin was gone. Then, when Topuria moved up to lightweight, and Volk was booked against Lopez for the vacant belt, the featherweight GOAT, who was the same age as Nina Drama, proved that he still had it in his old age. Volk schooled Lopez over the course of 5 rounds, winning a 49-46 decision. And yes, Volk got dropped. He got rocked, but he still showed that championship grit and heart. And this win over Lopez has gone on to age even better, as Lopez destroyed John Silva, who many thought was the greatest threat to peace in the Middle East. The featherweight belt, sorry. So really, we just see a hierarchy of talent, and Topuria sits at the top of it. Max Holloway, known for his ridiculous durability throughout his UFC career, was finally put out by Ilia Topuria during their fight for the featherweight belt. And look, Holloway did well, but Topuria's pressure and boxing was just too much. He won every round, took Holloway down, and just destroyed Max at his own game, really proving who's the best boxer you see, baby! But after this loss to Topuria, Max got a chance to right a wrong in his legacy against Dustin Poirier at UFC 318 for the Diamond's retirement fight. And during this fight, we saw a different version of Max. Max was less durable to be sure, getting dropped by Dustin, but he was also dropping Dustin with his shots, showing that lightweight Max had traded his indestructible chin for power. Or maybe it was Ilia who took his chin, but the power increase is definitely there. And in this fight, Max, who was 0-2 up against Dustin, finally got a win to close out the trilogy. And while I do think that Max is declining a bit, he is by no means washed, as those who are trying to take away from Ilia Topuria's win is. And finally, we come to Topuria's most recent win and the most recent beneficiary of the Ilia Topuria effect. Charles Oliveira fought Topuria for the vacant lightweight belt at UFC 317, where, frankly, he got dominated. With the exception of a single flush elbow, Topuria boxed Charles up on the feet, and once Charles tried to engage him on the ground, Topuria passed Charles' guard and put DeBronx in a crucifix. Charles went for a leg, so Ilia disengaged, which led to a fight going back to the feet, and Ilia just put him out cold. Completely unconscious. Now, at the time, we all thought that it might be the end for Charles since we haven't seen him laid out cold like that before. You know, even back when Charles was a journeyman at featherweight, those losses were TKOs, okay, not flatline KOs. So we ended up being very worried when it was announced that he was main eventing at UFC Brazil against Rafael Fiziev just months after getting starched by Ilia. And even after Fiziev pulled out and was replaced by Mateusz Gamrot on short notice, there were still many worried fans. I mean, Gamrot isn't exactly a power puncher, but he had dropped Dan Hooker in their fight. But when the time came, Charles just went after Gamrot. Even though Gamrot tagged up Charles, Charles just ignored the punches and pushed forward, getting a submission win in the second round after out-grappling Gamrot. And remember, Gamrot is the guy who went toe-to-toe with Arman in the grappling during their fight, and Charles is out here finishing him with little to no problem. So all of this just leads to us having to ask, just how good is Ilia Topuria? Well, obviously, not good enough to keep his wife from leaving him. As Khabib might say, brother, why marry Miami girl? When cousin, never leave.